Hi there, welcome back. Settle in, get cozy, and let this story carry you gently toward sleep. If it helps you rest, consider subscribing and turning on notifications for more calm stories like this one. Your comments always mean a lot. Feel free to leave one whenever you like. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin. Chapter 1, A Quiet City. Waiting for spring. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and let your mind drift back, gently, to the early spring of 1888. It's the first week of March, along the eastern coast of the United States. People are sensing the first soft edges of spring. The calendars show the final days of winter. Heavy coats are being folded away in closets. In the harbors, dockworkers move slowly through their routines. At the train stations, clerks stamp tickets and call out departures. In the crowded streets of New York, merchants call to one another, and carters guide their horses through the cold morning air, delivering coal to homes at will, they assume, needed for only a little while longer. Nothing about these days feels unusual. Nothing feels like a warning. The air is cool, but mild enough that people have started to relax. And that, more than anything else, is what makes this story so remarkable. Because within a matter of days, the world these people know so well is about to change completely, and almost none of them will see it coming. Take a slow breath in and out. In 1888, forecasting the weather was nothing like it is today. There were no satellites tracking storms from above the clouds. There was no way to share weather data quickly between distant cities. People relied on the sky itself, its color, its texture, the way the wind moved, and on memories of winters long past. So when a quiet weather system began to gather far out over the Atlantic, almost no one noticed it. It didn't announce itself. It simply began. Let your eyes stay closed, and picture it with me. Far to the north, a mass of bitterly cold air was drifting down from Canada. Far to the south, warm, moist air was rising off the Gulf. Neither of these two things, on their own, was unusual. Storms like this had happened before, and would happen again. But this time, the timing, the pressure, the angle at which these two air masses would meet, all of it lined up in a way that almost never happens. When they finally collided, the atmosphere above the eastern seaboard turned into something like a slow, silent battlefield in the sky. Warm air rose. It cooled as it climbed. Clouds thickened, and the light over the coastline dimmed hour by hour. At first, nobody thought anything of it. It looked, simply, like rain. Chapter 2, The Rain That Turned to Snow. Let's slow down even further here. There's no need to rush through any of this. On the morning of March 11th, in scattered towns and cities along the coast, a light rain began to fall. For many people, this felt reassuring, almost like the last small chore of winter, something to be waited out before the sun returned. Shopkeepers opened their doors as usual. Streetcars ran their routes. Office workers made their way in, umbrellas in hand, expecting an unremarkable Sunday and an equally unremarkable start to the week ahead. But the temperature was falling quietly, steadily, falling by the middle of the night. In New York City, the temperature had dropped from the low 30s to somewhere near 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Just before 1 in the morning, the falling rain quietly turned to snow. At first it was gentle, the kind of snow that looks pretty against street, the kind that makes a city feel soft for a while. But the wind was rising too. By early morning on March 12th, sustained winds of nearly 50 miles an hour were sweeping through the streets, and gusts even stronger than that would follow before the day was through. Winds that, by nightfall, would be measured at speeds close to 80 miles an hour in places. That kind of wind is not simply windy. That is hurt, and it was carrying snow sideways through the streets of a city that had gone to bed the night before expecting spring. You don't need to remember any of these numbers. Just let them settle quietly in the background, like snow gathering on a windowsill. Chapter 3, The City Goes Still breathing slowly. And now. By the time the sun rose fully over the coast that Monday morning, the world outside looked nothing like the world people had gone to sleep in. The sky had become a flat, heavy gray, the kind of gray that seems to press down on rooftops. The wind howled between buildings, echoing down the alleyways, rattling window frames. Snow no longer looked like snow. It moved almost horizontally, stinging against faces like tiny fragments of ice. People stepping outside, many of them still trying to reach work. unaware of just how serious the storm had become, found they could barely see a few steps ahead of themselves. Many New Yorkers, unfamiliar with true blizzard conditions, still tried to make it into the city that morning. As the day wore on and the weather worsened, they found themselves stranded in the streets, on stalled streetcars, on the elevated railway platforms, and inside their offices, with no way home. The elevated trains, usually one of the city's most reliable ways of getting around, came to a complete stop. One train derailed. Others simply froze in place on the tracks, unable to move forward or back, snow piling against their windows. By some estimates, as many as 15,000 people found themselves trapped on those elevated cars, waiting, with nothing to do but watch the white world outside grow thicker. Some enterprising New Yorkers brought ladders to the tracks, offering for a small fee to help stranded passengers climb down to the street. Isn't that strange to imagine? People quietly climbing down ladders through the howling wind, high above a city that had simply stopped functioning. Let that image rest in your mind for a moment, and let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting right now. Chapter 4. Snow like a living thing. There's no need to follow every detail closely. Just let the story move past you, like weather passing over a landscape. The snow did not fall the way ordinary snow falls. It did not simply drift down and settle evenly across rooftops and streets. It moved. It was carried, lifted, and thrown by wind that never seemed to rest. Snow that gathered against one wall in the morning might be gone entirely by afternoon, swept somewhere else, piled instead against a different corner, a different doorway. Streets that had felt familiar for years became unrecognizable within hours. In some places, snow reached no higher than a person's knee. Just a few steps away, along the very same street, drifts climbed as high as second-floor windows. People who had lived in the same house for decades looked out and, for a moment, felt as though they were looking at a completely different city. Street lamps disappeared beneath the snow, except for their very tops. Some rooftops sat lower than the drifts piled around them. Wooden fences vanished entirely, buried without a trace. When people tried to open their front doors that morning, many found not a street on the other side, but a solid wall of white. Some families had no choice but to climb out through second-floor windows, stepping directly onto the surface of the snow below, because there was simply no other way outside. Let your breathing slow again here, in and out. Snowdrifts in some places reached as high as 50 feet, taller than a 5-story building. It's almost impossible to picture, isn't it? An entire street, buried under something the height of a building. Chapter 5. When the world goes silent, this next part is quiet. Very quiet. Let yourself settle into that stillness with it, as the telegraph lines came down, snapped under the weight of ice. Torn loose by the wind, cities that had once felt closely connected to one another suddenly found themselves cut off completely. New York had no way of knowing what was happening in Philadelphia. A family in Boston could not reach relatives only a state away in New Jersey. Newspapers that were normally printed and delivered without a second thought simply didn't arrive. Communication, in 1888, depended almost entirely on those thin telegraph wires strung between poles across the countryside, and one by one, storm by storm, they came down. In the silence that followed, rumors began to spread instead of facts. Some people heard that hundreds had died. Others believed every ship along the coast had been lost. Others assumed the storm had only struck their own small corner of the world, and that everywhere else, life was continuing as normal. Not knowing, not being able to check, or confirm, or hear a familiar voice on the other end of a wire. That uncertainty weighed on people every bit as heavily as the cold itself. And yet, in the middle of all of that uncertainty, something quietly beautiful also began to happen. Chapter 6. Small kindnesses in a white world. Let your mind rest here for a while. This part is gentle, dotted neighborhood after neighborhood. As the storm raged outside, people began reaching out to one another. Some tunneled paths through the snow simply to check on an elderly neighbor. Some climbed over drifts and fences just to knock on a door and ask quietly, "Are you all right in there?" Bakers running low on flour shared what little they had left rather than keep it only for themselves. Families who had never spoken more than a passing greeting to one another suddenly found themselves sharing a meal, a fire, a warm room. The storm had closed off the roads completely, but in a strange and quiet way. It had also closed the distance between people. Out along the coastline, lighthouse keepers stayed at their posts through all of it. Waves crashed violently against the rocks below them. The wind shook their towers. At times, visibility disappeared almost entirely, swallowed by the blowing snow. And still, they didn't leave. Because somewhere out on that dark, churning water, ships were searching for any small point of light to guide them home. Working for hours in freezing conditions, those quiet, steady keepers may well have saved the lives of hundreds of sailors that week, sailors they never saw and would never meet. Isn't it strange how the loudest, most chaotic moments in history are so often carried gently on the backs of very small, very quiet acts of care? Let that thought stay with you for a moment, and let your body relax a little further. Chapter 7. At sea, this next part drifts out over the water. Let it carry you along slowly, while the storm tore through the cities. The ocean itself had become something almost unrecognizable. Ships along the Atlantic coast fought against waves far larger than anything their crews had prepared for. Even from land, people could see the white chaos churning far out past the shoreline. Winds threw vessels off their intended courses. Some were driven onto rocks. Others simply vanished, swallowed somewhere out in the dark, and were never seen again. Captains tried to steer through conditions where visibility had dropped to almost nothing, searching for lighthouse beams that flickered faintly through the blowing snow. By the time the storm finally passed, more than 200 ships had been grounded or wrecked along the coast. From the Chesapeake Bay up through New England, at least 100 sailors lost their lives at sea during those few days. It's a heavy thought, I know. Let it pass through you gently, the way the storm itself eventually passed. You don't need to hold on to it. Just let it drift by. Chapter 8. Trains frozen in open fields. Let your body sink a little heavier into your pillow now. We're moving into the quieter hours of the story, out in the open countryside. Away from the shelter of city buildings, the danger was even greater. Trains, the lifeline of the entire country in 1888, found their tracks buried and invisible beneath the snow. Some came to a stop in the middle of open fields, far from any station, far from any town. Passengers sat inside those frozen cars for hours, sometimes for a day or more, with only whatever food and fuel they happened to be carrying. Stepping outside, even briefly, could be dangerous. Visibility was almost non-existent. People could lose their sense of direction only a few steps from their own front door, let alone in unfamiliar, snow-covered fields. Historical accounts describe farmers who tried to walk the short distance to their own barns, and were later found in the snow, having lost their way in a space they had walked 1,000 times before. You don't have to picture this vividly. Just let the shape of it pass by, like something seen from a great distance, through fog. Let your breathing settle, slow and even. In and out. Chapter 9. Waiting it out here, the story slows almost to a stop. Much like the city itself did. In those days, by the second day of the storm, entire cities had come to a standstill. Factories sat empty. Shopkeepers couldn't open their doors. Newspapers, when they managed to print at all, couldn't be delivered. People stayed inside, watching the snow pile higher against their windows, listening to the wind howl through the gaps around their doors. Snow-clearing crews worked as hard as they could, but their effort barely made a difference. A street cleared in the morning could be buried again by early afternoon. The struggle, for most people, became less about clearing the streets and more about simply getting through each day, making sure there was enough coal to stay warm, enough food to last, enough patience to wait out something with no clear end in sight. And that, more than the cold itself, may have been the hardest part. Not knowing when it would end. If you know roughly how long something difficult will last, it's easier to bear. But when there's no end in sight, it feels heavier, slower, longer than it really is. Let yourself feel, just for a moment, how good it is that you know your own night has an end. That soft, quiet morning light is coming, whether you're awake to see it arrive or not. Let your eyes rest. Let your thoughts grow slower. There's nowhere you need to be right now, except right here. Chapter 10. A city, rediscovering itself even in the depths of the storm. Quiet, small wonders kept appearing. Street lamps glowed faintly through drifting curtains of snow, surrounded by softly swirling halos of light. Ice crystals, caught in that glow, drifted and spun like something out of a dream. Store windows, coated in frost, formed intricate patterns overnight, branching shapes that looked, some said, like tiny forests or ferns or the delicate lines of a map. Even in the middle of hardship, it seems the world kept quietly making its own small art. Inside their homes, families passed the long hours differently than usual. Without electric light, without radio, without any of the distractions we take for granted today, people simply talked. Elders told stories about winters long past. Children asked question after question about what was happening outside. Some of the family stories still passed down today, in fact, may trace their roots back to exactly these kinds of long, quiet evenings, because people don't just endure difficult things. They need to talk about them afterward, to make sense of what they lived through. Let your own thoughts grow quiet now, too. There's no need to hold on to anything. Just let them pass, gently, like snow outside a warm window. Chapter 11. When the snow finally stopped after 3 long days from the 11th of March to the 14th, the wind at last began to soften. The snow, which had seemed as though it might never stop, slowed, and slowed further. And finally came the rest. The sun reappeared, tentatively between the clouds. Slowly, life began to stir again. Streets were cleared, one narrow path at a time. Trains, buried for days, were dug free. Store shutters creaked open. Somewhere a telegraph clicked back to life, carrying the first news in days to a city that had felt, for a little while, entirely alone in the world. When it was all over, the numbers were staggering. More than 400 people had lost their lives across the eastern seaboard, roughly 200 of them in New York City alone. Property damage in New York exceeded $20 million, an enormous sum for the time. Snowfall in the hardest hit areas reached nearly 50 inches, and the storm left behind something that would shape the future of American cities for decades. The realization that telegraph wires, power lines, and even train systems needed to move underground, safely out of the reach of storms like this one. In the years that followed, this exact realization helped drive the construction of the first subway systems in Boston, and then New York systems that are still in daily use today. More than a century later, isn't it a strange kind of comfort to know that even something as overwhelming, as frightening, as this storm eventually led somewhere, that the world, slowly, rebuilt itself to be a little more resilient than it had been before? Let that thought rest with you now. Slow, steady, settled. Chapter 12. What people remembered in the years that followed. When people who had lived through the storm were asked to talk about it, they rarely mentioned numbers. They didn't talk much about wind speed, or inches of snowfall, or barometric pressure. What stayed with them, what they carried for the rest of their lives, were the small human details. A neighbor climbing out through a rooftop window, the particular color of the sky just before the worst of it hit, the sound of a telegraph clicking back to life after days of silence, the first warm meal shared with someone they'd never met before that week. For decades afterward, survivors of the storm gathered every year to mark its anniversary, a tradition that continued, remarkably, all the way until 1969. More than 80 years later, and for almost 60 years, New York's snowfall record from that single storm remained unbroken, until one more blizzard, in 1947, finally surpassed it. But numbers were never really the point. The real story, the one that outlived every statistic, was the story of a city, and its people quietly discovering just how fragile and how resilient ordinary life can be. Chapter 13. A world without color. Let your thoughts slow down again here. There's no need to hurry through any part of this. One of the quieter, stranger effects of the storm was the way it seemed to erase color from the world. Normally, our eyes rely on color to make sense of a place. A red sign here, a brown building there, a black carriage rolling past, a patch of green grass peeking through a fence. These small splashes of color are how a mind quietly maps its surroundings without even trying. But during the worst hours of the blizzard, all of that color simply withdrew. The city became a vast canvas of white, gray, and pale, muted black. People weren't only losing their sense of direction, they were losing the small visual anchors that had always helped them feel oriented in the first place. Years later, some who lived through it described the whole experience as feeling almost like a dream. Something not quite real, softened at the edges, drained of its usual sharpness. Isn't that a strange kind of stillness to imagine? An entire city, temporarily without color, waiting quietly for the world to return to itself. Let your own eyelids feel heavy now, the way that whitened world must have felt to the people inside it, soft and dim and slow. Chapter 14. Listen into a different city. Breathe in slowly and let it out, even more slowly than before. Sound behaves differently in heavy snow. Thick drifts absorb noise, swallowing it before it can travel very far. In some parts of the city, this created an almost complete stillness, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any ordinary quiet. People found it strange at first how hard it became to tell where a sound was coming from. A voice calling out from several streets away might suddenly sound very close, right at the edge of hearing. Meanwhile, movement in the very next room, or just outside a nearby door, could feel muffled and distant, almost as if it belonged to a different world entirely. This made things harder for anyone trying to help someone else. A cry for help could be carried off by the wind in an entirely unpredictable direction, arriving somewhere far from where it had actually been spoken. Rescuers had to rely as much on instinct as on their ears, and yet, in the in-between hours, when the wind occasionally softened, people described the hush unlike anything they'd experienced before. No carriages, no footsteps, no distant clatter of a busy harbor, just snow falling quietly into a city that had, for a little while, forgotten how to make noise. Let that same hush settle over you now, if you can. Let the sounds around you fade gently into the background, the way the city's noise faded into the snow. Chapter 15. Footprints as guides. Let your body settle a little deeper. There's nothing you need to do right now but rest. In ordinary times, a footprint left on a sidewalk means almost nothing. It disappears from notice within seconds, forgotten before it's even fully formed. But during those white disorienting days, every footprint told a small story. Stepping outside was, in itself, an effort, a decision not made lightly. So when someone did see a set of footprints crossing an otherwise untouched stretch of snow, it meant something. It meant someone else had been brave enough, or desperate enough, to make that same journey. Not long before, people began to follow each other's tracks instinctively, using footprints the way a traveler might use a trail marker in unfamiliar woods. In a landscape where street signs, fences, and even entire buildings had become unrecognizable, these small, fading impressions in the snow were sometimes the only guide anyone had. It's a gentle thought, in its own way. Strangers, never meeting, never even knowing of each other's existence, quietly leading one another home through a single line of footprints pressed into the snow. Let your own breathing form its own quiet rhythm now. Slow, and even like footsteps, falling gently, one after another, into softness. Chapter 16. The weight on the rooftops. This part is slow and heavy. Let your body feel heavy along with it, sinking further into rest, as the snow kept falling. Hour after hour, it didn't just gather in the streets. It gathered on rooftops too, quietly, invisibly, adding weight that most people never thought to consider until it became impossible to ignore. Inside their homes, some residents began hearing faint creaking sounds from above, a soft groan in a wooden beam, a slow uneven cracking somewhere in the ceiling. At the time, few people fully understood what those sounds meant, but they understood enough to feel uneasy. Tons of snow, silently accumulating overhead, were pressing down on structures never designed to bear that kind of load. Icicles grew long and heavy along the edges of roofs, hanging like pale frozen chains. Wooden beams strained quietly under the pressure. In a strange way, entire buildings seemed to be holding their breath along with the people inside them, creaking, adjusting, absorbing the storm the same way a living thing might. You don't need to worry about any of this, of course. It happened a very long time ago, and the story, like the storm itself, has long since passed. Just let the image rest gently in your mind. Snow settling softly onto old rooftops, safe now, and quiet. Chapter 17. 2 ways of seeing the same storm. Let your thoughts slow. The way a very long day slows down at its very end. Inside the houses where families waited out the storm together, something interesting happened. Children and adults, looking out at exactly the same white world, seemed to see 2 entirely different things. For many children, the enormous drifts of snow became something wonderful, small mountains to imagine climbing, a whole new landscape appearing right outside their door. unlike anything they'd ever seen before. For a child, a street transformed overnight into an unrecognizable snowscape wasn't frightening. It was thrilling. For the adults in those same houses, the feeling was very different. They thought about the coal supply, slowly dwindling in the cellar. They thought about the food left in the pantry, and how many days it might need to last. They wondered, quietly, when it might be safe to return to work, and what waited for them once they did. The very same snowfall, the very same wind, the very same silence outside the window, and yet it meant something completely different depending on who was looking at it. Maybe that's true of a lot of things in life, isn't it? The same moment landing differently on each of us, depending on what we're carrying inside. Let your own mind rest now, gently, the way a tired child eventually rests. No matter how exciting the day has been. Chapter 18, waiting for the sky to change. Slow down here with me. There's no need to follow every word too closely. Just let the sound of the story wash over you. As the days wore on, people found themselves doing something they rarely did in ordinary times, staring up at the sky for long stretches, trying to read it. Was the gray a little lighter than yesterday? Had the wind lost some of its force? Was there, somewhere far off along the horizon, the faintest hint of clearing? None of them were trained meteorologists, but in the absence of any other source of information, with the telegraphs down, the newspapers silent, the world beyond their own street entirely unknown to them, the sky itself became the only source of news anyone had. People became quiet students of the clouds, of the wind's shifting pitch, of the smallest, most subtle changes in the light. In a way, everyone became, for a little while, an amateur forecaster, watching, waiting, hoping for the first genuine sign that the worst had passed. There's something soothing in that image, I think. Whole communities, quietly, patiently, watching the sky together, waiting for something better. You can let your own eyes rest closed now, the way theirs eventually did too. Trusting that morning, like it always does, was already on its way. Chapter 19. The city wakes up again. Let your body feel loose and warm now, heavy and calm and unhurried. Slowly, never all at once, but slowly, the city began to come back to life. It didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened one small step at a time. A single street, cleared enough for a horse and cart to pass through. A single rail line, dug free enough for one train to move cautiously along it. A single shop, its shutters creaking open for the first time in days. People stepped outside cautiously at first, almost as if testing whether the world they remembered was really still there underneath all that snow. And slowly, they found that it was buried, changed, reshaped in places, but still there. The sounds of the city returned gradually to the rhythmic clatter of wheels on cobblestones, voices calling out again in the streets, the distant, welcome whistle of a train finally moving again after days of silence. Two people who had spent days surrounded by an eerie hush. These ordinary sounds felt, for a little while, like old friends returning after a long absence. It's a comforting thought to end this part of the story on. The world always seems to find its way back to its ordinary rhythms, even after the most extraordinary interruptions. Let your own breathing settle into its own familiar rhythm now, slow and steady, carrying you gently toward sleep. Chapter 20. What the storm left behind. This is one of the last parts of the story. Let yourself sink even further down now, heavy and calm. When the cleanup was finally finished, and the last of the snow had melted away into the spring that had, all along, been waiting patiently behind it, people began to notice something. The storm hadn't just tested the strength of buildings, or trains, or telegraph wires. It had tested something less visible, the quiet, invisible systems that keep a city running every single day without anyone ever noticing them. It takes hundreds of small, coordinated efforts just for a single train to run on time. It takes dozens of interconnected systems just for a harbor to function normally on an ordinary morning. Most days none of that effort is visible at all. It simply happens, quietly, in the background, the way your own breathing happens right now, without you needing to think about it. The storm made all of that invisible effort suddenly, briefly, visible, and in doing so, it left behind more than just memories. It left behind decisions about wires moved safely underground, about new systems built to carry people beneath the streets instead of above them, about a city quietly resolving to be a little more resilient the next time the sky turned against it. Let your own thoughts settle now, the way that old resilient city eventually settled too. Quiet, steady, and at peace. Chapter 21. The harbor gone quiet. Let your body sink a little deeper again. There's still a while left in this story, and nowhere you need to be but here. Before the storm, the harbor was one of the loudest, busiest places in the entire city. From early morning until well after dark, it was full of shouted orders, the creak of loading cranes, the deep call of ship horns drifting out over the water. It never really stopped, but during the blizzard, the harbor fell almost completely silent. The ropes that tied ships to the docks froze solid, stiff as iron rods. Thick sheets of ice formed across the wooden platforms where workers usually hurried back and forth all day. Ice built up along the sides of the ships themselves, layer after layer, until some vessels looked larger and stranger than their crews even remembered them being. A few sailors, wakened after a long night anchored in the storm, said they barely recognized their own ship beneath all that ice. Where there had once been constant motion, there was now only the low, steady moan of the wind, sweeping unopposed across an empty, frozen harbor. Let that same stillness settle over you now, quiet and slow and undisturbed. Chapter 22. Distances that no longer made sense. Slow your breathing a little further. In and out, nice and easy. One of the strangest effects of the storm was how it changed people's sense of distance. A walk that would normally take only half an hour suddenly felt like a full expedition into unknown territory. People bundled up carefully before stepping outside, packed a little food, dressed as though preparing for a real journey, because they genuinely had no idea what they might encounter only a few streets away. This slowed the entire rhythm of the city down. People who were used to moving quickly, always hurrying somewhere, were forced for the first time in a long while to simply stop, to wait, to move carefully, one step at a time, instead of rushing forward the way they always had. In a strange way, the storm taught an entire city something it had almost forgotten, that waiting too is simply a part of life, that not every moment needs to be filled with movement. There's something worth carrying with you in that thought, even now, even here, as you rest, that it's alright to simply wait, to simply be still. There's nowhere you need to rush toward tonight. Chapter 23. Shadows that disappeared. Let your eyelids feel heavy now. The way the whole city's edges seemed to soften and blur during those days. Ordinarily, cities are full of shadows, the shadows of buildings, of carriages, of people walking past one another on the street. These small dark shapes, without anyone consciously noticing, help our eyes judge distance and depth almost automatically. But with the sky completely overcast, and every surface blanketed in the same pale white, that contrast simply vanished. The world seemed to flatten. Depth became difficult to judge. Distances that should have been easy to estimate suddenly felt uncertain and strange. It's part of why so many people, describing those days afterward, reached for dreamlike language to explain what they'd experienced. The ordinary visual rules their eyes had always relied on had quietly stopped applying. If only for a few days, let your own sense of the room around you soften now. 2. The edges blurring gently, the way sleep always begins. A slow fading of sharp lines into something softer and dimmer, and easier to simply let go of. Chapter 24. The city's missing smell. This part is a small, quiet detail. Let it drift by gently, like a familiar scent from long ago. It's a detail people rarely think to mention, but it's true all the same. The storm changed the way the city smelled. In ordinary times, a city carries dozens of overlapping scents. The harbor, the horses, the smoke from countless factories, the crowds of people moving through the streets all day. All of it blends together into something so familiar that most people stop noticing it entirely. But heavy snowfall muffles smell almost as thoroughly as it muffles sound. The cold slows everything down. The snow itself seems to settle gently over every scent, the way it settles over every sound and every color. Some who lived through those days later said the air felt unusually clean, almost startlingly so, in the middle of everything else that was happening. It's a small, strange kind of beauty tucked inside a difficult moment, isn't it? The world quietly clearing itself, even while everything else felt so overwhelming. Let your own breathing feel clean and easy now too. Slow, unhurried, calm. Chapter 25. The animals of the storm. Let yourself settle even further down now. This part is gentle and slow and simple. People were not the only ones whose lives were disrupted by the storm. Horses, so central to everyday life in 1888, grew restless and uneasy in their stables, unsettled by the howling wind. Birds that would normally be seen moving calmly through the streets seemed to vanish entirely, blown far off course by gusts too strong to fly against. Near the harbor, residents noticed birds and other creatures appearing that were rarely, if ever, seen in the city center. Pushed there, it seemed, by the storm itself. Nature, it turns out, doesn't only reshape the world that people live in. During something this large, it reshapes the quiet, careful rhythms of every other living creature too. If only for a little while. Let that same gentleness settle over you now, calm and quiet and safe, wherever you happen to be resting tonight. Chapter 26. Looking down from the rooftops, breathe in slowly and let it out, even more slowly than before. Some of the more adventurous residents, when the wind occasionally eased, made their way up to their rooftops during those days, not for any particular reason, but simply to see. And what they saw looking down was almost impossible to describe afterward. From above, the streets themselves were barely visible at all, except for the narrow paths people had carved out with great effort. The entire city below looked like one continuous, unbroken sheet of white. Rooftops rose up like small islands scattered across an enormous frozen sea. It was, by every account, one of the strangest and most beautiful sights anyone in that city had ever witnessed. A familiar skyline made suddenly completely unfamiliar. Photographs taken in the days that followed still carry some of that strangeness today. Looking at them now, it's easy to forget you're looking at a real city, rather than some quiet, imagined, snow-covered world from a dream. Let your own mind drift into that same soft snow-covered quiet now, calm and still, and very far from anywhere you need to be. Chapter 27. News that took days to arrive slowed down here again. There's no need to hold on to any of these details too tightly. It's worth pausing for a moment to think about how different this experience would feel today. In our own time, news of a storm like this would reach the entire world within seconds, appearing on phone screens before the first snowflake had even finished falling. In 1888, it was nothing like that. When the telegraph lines came down, cities went, in a very real sense, dark. People sometimes waited for days before hearing anything reliable about towns only a short distance away. Newspapers, when they managed to print at all, often arrived late, incomplete, or not at all. That silence shaped the entire experience of the storm as much as the snow itself did. It wasn't only a battle against the cold and the wind. It was also a long, quiet wait for information, for any small proof that the rest of the world was still out there, going on, unharmed. There's a strange kind of comfort in comparing that world to our own, isn't there? A reminder of how much has changed, and how, even now, some of the oldest human needs to know that others are safe, to hear a familiar voice again, never really change at all. Let your own thoughts settle now, calm and unhurried, trusting that everything and everyone is exactly where it needs to be tonight. Chapter 28. A winter of two storms. This is one of the final quiet details in the story. Let it settle over you gently. It's easy to think of the great blizzard of 1888 as a single, isolated event, one extraordinary storm, in one particular week, in one part of the country. But that winter, as it turned out, was unusually severe almost everywhere. Just 2 months earlier, in January of that same year, a different and equally fierce storm had swept across the Great Plains and the Midwest. Far to the west, it struck suddenly, in the middle of the day, catching many school children on their walk home from small isolated schoolhouses. It's remembered today as the Children's Blizzard, and it too claimed hundreds of lives. Two storms, in two very different parts of the same country, in the very same winter, each one a quiet reminder of just how unprepared the world of 1888 still was for the full, sudden force of nature. Let your own world feel safe and warm now, by comparison, sheltered and quiet, and very far removed from any storm at all. Chapter 29. The long walk home. Slow your breathing again, all the way down, in and out, gently. Among all the stories that survived from those days, one in particular is often remembered, the story of a powerful, well-known political figure in New York who, when the storm hit, decided to walk home from his office rather than wait it out. It seemed at the time like a small decision, a short walk through familiar streets in weather he assumed he could manage.
He never fully recovered from the exposure he suffered on that walk, and he passed away only a few weeks later. It's a quiet, sobering detail tucked into a much larger story, a reminder that even the most capable, most confident people can be humbled by something as simple and as old as the wind and the cold. Nature, in the end, has never cared very much about anyone's rank or reputation, or how many times they'd made a similar walk before without incident. Let that thought rest gently with you, not as something frightening, but simply as something true. A small reminder to be gentle with yourself tonight and to let rest come easily, the way it should. Chapter 30. What the city learned. This is nearly the end now. Let yourself feel completely at ease. In the years that followed the storm, city planners and engineers looked back at what had happened and asked themselves a simple question. How could a single storm bring an entire modern city so completely to its knees? The answers they found reshaped the physical fabric of American cities for generations. Telegraph wires, once strung openly along poles above every street, were moved safely underground. Elevated railways, so vulnerable to wind and snow, gave way over time to underground subway systems, first in Boston, and soon after in New York, systems that still carry millions of people every single day. More than 100 years later, in this way, the story of the storm never really ended when the snow finally melted. It continued quietly for decades in the choices made by people who had never even lived through it themselves, but who inherited its lessons all the same. Let your own thoughts settle now, slow and complete, the way along. Difficult story finally settles into rest. Chapter 31. A city full of strangers, waiting together. Let your body feel loose now, heavy and warm, sinking into wherever you're resting. As the storm stretched into its second and third day, ordinary buildings around the city quietly became something else. Hotels filled far beyond their usual capacity, every room taken by people who simply couldn't make it home. Saloons, normally quiet in the middle of the day, filled with people seeking nothing more than warmth and a roof over their heads. Even large public halls opened their doors to anyone who needed shelter, strangers sitting side by side, waiting out the same storm together, in one of the city's grand public spaces. A well-known showman opened his doors and spent hours quietly entertaining the crowd of strangers stranded there. Magic tricks, songs, small performances, anything to make the long hours of waiting feel a little lighter. It's a small, warm detail tucked inside a much larger, colder story. Proof that even in the middle of genuine hardship, people instinctively look for small ways to comfort one another. Let that same warmth settle over you now, wherever you are. Safe, sheltered, and calm. Chapter 32. The stock exchange, nearly empty. Slow your breathing again. There's no rush to any part of this. Even the busiest, most important places in the city came to a near complete stop. On Wall Street, where hundreds of people usually hurried in and out every single morning, almost no one managed to arrive at all on the worst day of the storm. Out of every 1,000 people who might normally have made the walk to work that day, only a small handful actually succeeded. The exchange itself was forced to close its doors entirely for several days in a row, something almost unheard of. Even in difficult times, it's a strange thing to imagine, isn't it? One of the most powerful, fast-moving places in the entire country, brought to complete stillness by nothing more than snow and wind. A reminder that no system, however important it seems, is ever truly separate from the natural world around. It doth let your own thoughts slow down the same way now. Quiet, still, and unhurried. Chapter 33. Digging out. One shovel at a time, let your breathing settle into something slow and steady. In and out, easy and unhurried. There were no snowplows in 1888 the way we might imagine them today. Clearing the streets meant horses and oxen pulling heavy wooden plows through drift after drift, and, more often than not, it simply meant people with shovels, working slowly. One small section of street at a time. In some places, the packed. Wind-hardened snow had grown so solid that shovels barely made a mark against it, and workers had to resort to pickaxes just to break through the surface. Clearing a single stretch of railway track sometimes took over a week of steady, exhausting effort. It was slow, patient, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely makes it into dramatic retellings of the storm, but without which the city could never have come back to life at all. There's something quietly admirable in that kind of effort, isn't there? No single dramatic moment, just hour after hour of patient, steady work until finally the world reopens itself again. Let your own body feel that same patient stillness now. Nothing to rush, nothing to force, just slow, steady rest. Chapter 34. When the snow finally melted, this part is soft and slow and warm. Let it settle over you gently. Weeks after the storm had passed, as temperatures gradually climbed and the last of the great drifts began to shrink, a new problem quietly emerged. All that snow, once it began to melt, had to go somewhere. In low-lying areas, especially near the waterfront in Brooklyn, the melting snow caused serious flooding, turning streets that had recently been buried in white into shallow. Temporary rivers instead. It was a strange kind of ending for the story, not a clean, sudden finish, but a slow, gradual, sometimes messy return to normal life. Snow into water, water finding its way, eventually, back to the sea. The world quietly resetting itself in its own unhurried time. Let your own body feel that same slow release now. Any tension you're holding gently melting away, the way that old snow eventually did, with nowhere left to be but calm. Chapter 35. The first article ever written about it. Let your eyes rest fully closed now. If they aren't already, there's nothing left to watch for tonight. The following year, in the very first issue of a magazine that would go on to become one of the most respected publications in the world, a long article appeared describing in careful detail everything that had happened during those 4 days in March. It was one of the earliest attempts to gather the whole story together in one place. The science of the storm, the human stories, the damage, and the quiet lessons learned from it. It's a small detail, but a meaningful one. Even in that very first year after the storm, people already understood they had lived through something worth remembering carefully, and worth passing on. And here you are now, more than a century later, still listening to that same story, carried gently forward through all these years, all the way to tonight. Let that thought rest with you softly. A story, passed quietly from one generation to the next, finally arriving here with you as you drift towards sleep. Chapter 36, a slow breathing exercise. Borrowed from the storm, let's slow all the way down together now. There's nothing to think about here except your own breath. Picture, if you can, the moment when the storm's wind, after 3 long days of howling without pause, finally, slowly began to ease. Breathe in gently, and imagine the wind rising just slightly, the way it did in its final hours, and breathe out slow and complete. Imagine that same wind falling, quieter than before. In, rising just a little, out, falling a little further each time. In, softer now, out, softer still. There's no storm left to imagine now. Only your own breath, slow and steady and calm. In and out. Exactly the way the wind itself finally, gently, came to rest. Chapter 37. Streets reopening, one by one. Let your body feel heavier now. Completely relaxed, completely at ease. In the days that followed, the city reopened itself slowly, street by street, almost like a long, unhurried exhale after days of held breath. First, a single narrow path, carved through by hand. Then, cautiously, a horse and cart moving along it. Then a full street, wide enough for 2 carriages to pass one another again. Then, at last, whole neighborhoods waking up together. People stepped outside to see their own city again for what felt like the first time. Familiar streets, changed but recognizable, still there beneath everything that had happened. Shop owners swept their doorways. Children, delighted, played in the enormous, slowly shrinking piles of leftover snow. Life, in its quiet, ordinary way, began again. Let your own body do the same thing now. Slowly opening into rest, one soft breath at a time, until there's nothing left to do but simply be still. Chapter 38. A story told around warm fires. This is nearly the very end now. Let everything in your body soften completely. For years afterward, in homes up and down the coast, this story was told and retold, usually on cold winter nights, usually by someone who had lived through it themselves, to children and grandchildren who hadn't, each retelling softened the story a little, rounded its edges, turned it slowly from a frightening memory into something closer to folklore. A story about a city that disappeared under the snow for a few days, and then, quietly, patiently, found its way back. That's often how difficult things become over enough time. Not forgotten, exactly, just gently transformed into something calmer, something that can finally be told slowly, softly, the way this story has just been told to you. Let your own mind grow quiet and still now, the way an old story finally settles into its truest, calmest form. Resting at last, completely at peace. Chapter 39, Counting Snowflakes. There's nothing left to do now except rest. So let's close with something very simple. Imagine, if you'd like, standing quietly at an old window, somewhere warm and safe, watching snow fall gently outside, slow, soft, unhurried snow. Nothing like the storm itself, just an ordinary, Peaceful snowfall. One snowflake. Drifting down, slow and light. 2 snowflakes. Settling softly on the sill. 3, 4, 5. Each one quieter than the last. You don't need to keep counting. You don't need to keep track of anything at all. Just let the snow keep falling, gently in your mind, for as long as you need it to, until your thoughts grow quiet, until your body feels completely at rest, until, without even noticing exactly when, you finally drift off to sleep. Chapter 40. The weight of waiting. Let your body settle even further down. There's still time left in this story, and nowhere at all you need to be. Something interesting happens to the mind when it doesn't know how long a difficult thing will last. In the first day of the storm, most people assumed it was temporary, a rough patch of weather that would pass by morning. By the second day, they began adjusting, quietly rearranging their expectations. But by the third day, a different feeling crept in. Not panic, exactly. Something quieter than that. A kind of tiredness that had less to do with the cold, and more to do with simply not knowing when it would end. It's worth noticing, gently, how different that feeling is from the rest you're settling into right now. You know, without needing to think about it, that tonight will end. That morning is coming, quietly, on its own schedule, whether you're awake for its very first moment or not. There's a kind of ease in that certainty, one those people, waiting out their storm, didn't get to have. Let yourself borrow a little of that ease now, trusting completely, the way you always can. That rest will come, and morning will follow, exactly as it always does. Chapter 41. Frost on the window pane. Slow your breathing again, all the way down, in and out, calm and unhurried. Store windows across the city, glazed with a fine layer of ice, became a quiet kind of gallery during those days. Overnight, delicate frost patterns spread slowly across the glass, branching lines that looked, depending on the light, like tiny frozen trees or ferns unfurling, or the faint outline of rivers on some imagined miniature map. Shopkeepers, arriving each morning to dig their way to their own front doors, pause sometimes just to look at these patterns before clearing them away. It's a small, easily overlooked detail in the middle of such a large and difficult story, but it says something true about people. Even in hardship, even exhausted, even worried about supplies and safety, people still noticed beauty when it appeared in front of them. They still paused, just for a moment, to look. Let yourself do the same thing now, in your own quiet way, noticing the calm, gentle beauty of simply resting, simply being still, simply allowing yourself this slow, easy pause at the end of a long day. Chapter 42. The sound of the first train. Let your body feel completely heavy now, sinking further into rest with every breath. After days of silence, the sound of the first train finally moving again became, for many people, one of the most memorable moments of the entire storm. Not because the sound itself was unusual. Trains had rumbled through that city every single day for years, so ordinary that most people have long since stopped consciously hearing them at all. But after days without that sound, its return felt different. People paused in the street to listen. Some later admitted, half embarrassed, that the sound had brought tears to their eyes, not from anything dramatic, just from the simple, overwhelming relief of hearing the ordinary world quietly start up again. It's a gentle reminder, isn't it, of how much comfort lives inside completely ordinary sounds. A train in the distance, rain against a window, the quiet hum of a house at night. Sounds we rarely think about until, for whatever reason, they go quiet for a while. Let the ordinary sounds around you now, however quiet, however small, feel like exactly that kind of comfort tonight. Chapter 43. What stayed with them? This part is slow and reflective and calm. Let your mind simply drift along with it. Decades later, when historians began collecting interviews from the very last living survivors of the storm, they noticed something consistent across almost every single account. Nobody talked much about the exact numbers anymore. Nobody described wind speeds or snowfall totals or dates with any real precision. What they remembered instead were scenes. A single image held perfectly clear in their minds for 50, 60, 70 years. A drift rising all the way to a rooftop. A streetcar buried up to its windows. A neighbor's face framed in a doorway, asking quietly if everyone was safe. Our minds, it seems, were never really built to hold on to numbers. They hold on to moments instead, small, specific human moments carried carefully across entire lifetimes. Perhaps that's exactly what you'll carry with you from this story too, once you wake tomorrow. Not the numbers, but simply the quiet feeling of it. A story about people patiently waiting out something enormous. Together, let your own mind settle now into whichever small, quiet feeling from tonight it wants to keep. Calm, warm, and completely at rest. Chapter 44. A very slow walk through a snow-covered street. Let's take one last slow walk together before this story finally comes to rest. Picture a single quiet street, sometime after the storm has passed. The wind has softened completely now. The sky, once heavy and gray, has cleared into something pale and calm. Snow is piled high along both sides of the street, but the path down the middle has been cleared, narrow and quiet, waiting. Take one slow step forward. Feel how quiet everything is. Another step. The faint crunch of snow beneath you, softened by the stillness around it. Another. The cold air, calm now, gentle against your face. There's nowhere you need to walk to. No one waiting anywhere in particular. Just this slow, quiet street, this soft, settled air, this feeling of a long storm finally, completely over. Let your own steps slow further and further, until, at last, they come to a gentle, easy stop, and there's nothing left to do now but rest. Chapter 45. The weight of an ordinary coat. Let your body settle again, heavy and warm. There's still a little more of this story left to drift through. Before the storm arrived, most people along the coast had already begun preparing their homes for spring. Heavy winter coats were being folded away. Thick blankets were being aired out and stored in cedar chests. Firewood, so carefully rationed all winter long, was being used a little more freely, since everyone assumed the worst of the cold season was finally behind them. When the blizzard struck, all of that quiet, hopeful preparation suddenly reversed itself. Coats came back out of closets in a hurry. Blankets were pulled from storage and piled thickly onto beds. Families who had begun to relax their careful winter routines found themselves scrambling almost overnight back into the deepest habits of midwinter survival. There's something very human in that small detail, isn't there? The way we prepare so carefully for what we expect, and then have to adjust quickly and quietly when the world decides to surprise us instead. It happened to an entire coastline of people at once, all in the space of a single night. Let your own body feel warm and prepared now, wrapped in whatever comfort you have around you. Safe from any storm at all tonight. Chapter 46. A loaf of bread, shared slow your breathing again. In and out, unhurried and calm. Among the many small stories that survived from those days, one detail appears again and again in different neighborhoods, told by different families in slightly different ways. A baker, running low on flour as the storm dragged into its second or third day, decided not to save what remained only for paying customers. Instead, the last of it was shared freely. A loaf here, a loaf there, with anyone nearby who needed it. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't reported in any newspaper, because the newspapers themselves weren't being delivered at the time. It was simply one small, quiet decision made by an ordinary person in the middle of an extraordinary few days. Multiply that single loaf of bread by hundreds of similar small decisions, made in kitchens and shops and doorways up and down the coast, and you begin to understand something important about how a whole city survives something like this. Not through any single heroic act, but through thousands of small, quiet ones, layered gently on top of each other. Let that same quiet generosity settle over your thoughts now. Warm, simple, and calm. Chapter 47. The clock that kept ticking let your eyelids feel heavy again. There's nothing left to watch for, nothing left to wait on. Inside many homes during the storm. Ordinary clocks kept ticking along exactly as they always had, seconds passing steadily into minutes, minutes steadily into hours, entirely indifferent to the chaos happening just outside the window. It was, for some people, a strange comfort. For others, a strange kind of torment, watching the hands move so calmly through hours that felt, from the inside, unbearably long and uncertain. Time itself seemed to behave differently during those days. An afternoon could feel like it lasted twice as long as it should have. A single hour of waiting, with no clear sense of when the storm might finally ease, could feel heavier than an entire ordinary day. And yet the clock never lied. It simply, patiently, kept moving forward second by second, the same way it always had, the same way it always would, carrying everyone, whether they felt it or not, steadily closer to the storm's end. Let your own sense of time soften now, the way it should at the end of a long day. No need to watch the clock at all tonight. Just let the minutes pass gently, on their own, while you rest. Chapter 48. Letters written but not sent. This part is quiet and slow. Let it settle over you like a soft blanket. With the telegraph lines down and the postal service completely halted, many people turned instead to something much older, pen and paper. Letters were written by candlelight to family members only a few streets away, or to loved ones much further off, with no real way to know when, or whether, those letters might ever be delivered. Some of those letters described the storm itself, in careful, curious detail, as if the writer somehow already sensed this was a moment worth recording. Others were far simpler, just a few lines, reassuring someone far away that they were safe, warm, and waiting quietly for the weather to pass. Many of those letters sat for days before they could finally be sent. Some, historians later learned, were simply kept, tucked into drawers and boxes, treasured quietly for decades afterward, not because of what they said, but because of what they represented. A quiet reaching out, across distance and uncertainty, toward someone who mattered. Let your own thoughts reach gently toward whoever matters to you tonight. 2, if you'd like. Calm, warm, and unhurried. The way an old letter waits patiently to be read. Chapter 49. The sound of melting let your body feel completely loose now. Soft and warm and slow. Days after the wind had finally calmed, a new sound began to fill the city, quieter than the storm itself, but noticeable all the same. A steady, gentle drip of melting snow, sliding slowly off rooftops, gathering along gutters, trickling down through narrow streets that had been buried in white for what felt. By then, like a very long time. It wasn't a dramatic sound. It didn't announce itself the way the wind had. It simply arrived, quietly, one drop at a time, and grew a little steadier with each passing day. For a city that had spent nearly a week wrapped in silence and stillness, that soft, ongoing drip became, in its own small way, one of the most hopeful sounds anyone could imagine. Proof, drop by drop, that warmth really was returning. Let that same soft, steady sound play quietly in your mind now, if it helps. A gentle drip, unhurried and calm, marking the slow, certain return of warmth and rest. Chapter 50. A very old kind of comfort. We're nearing the very end now. Let your body feel as heavy and calm as it possibly can. In the end, what carried people through those 4 extraordinary days wasn't any single remarkable thing. It wasn't clever technology, because so little of it existed yet. It wasn't official guidance, because there was almost none available. It was something much older and much simpler than any of that. It was neighbors checking on neighbors. It was warm rooms shared with strangers. It was patience, quietly practiced, hour after hour, day after day. It was the simple, steady belief, even without any real proof, that eventually the sky would clear and life would continue. That same old, simple comfort is available to you tonight, too, in its own quiet way. No storm to wait out, no uncertainty to sit with. Just rest, freely given to yourself, exactly the way those quiet acts of kindness were freely given all those years ago, to strangers who needed them. Let yourself receive that same comfort now. Calm, complete, and entirely your own. Chapter 51. The church bells that didn't ring. Let your body settle a little further down. There's still a small while left before the story finally closes. In many towns along the coast, Sunday services had to be canceled entirely on the very day the storm began, something almost unheard of at the time. Church bells, which usually marked the rhythm of the week so reliably that people barely noticed them, stayed silent for days, buried under snow along with everything else. For some, that silence felt unsettling, one more familiar sound missing from a world that had already lost so many of them. For others, it became something quieter and more personal. Without the usual gathering, without the usual routine, some people found themselves simply sitting quietly at home, reflecting in their own way, in their own time, on everything that was happening around them. There's something worth noticing in that, even now. How the absence of a familiar ritual can sometimes make room for a different, more private kind of stillness. A quiet moment, found not in a crowd, but alone, or with only a few loved ones nearby. Let that same private stillness settle over you now gently. In whatever way feels right tonight. Chapter 52. The doctor who walked anyways. Low your breathing again. All the way down. In and out. Calm and even. Not everyone stayed inside during the worst of the storm. In several towns, doctors made the difficult decision to venture out anyway, moving carefully and slowly from house to house, checking on patients who couldn't be reached any other way. Some walked for hours through drifts taller than themselves, guided as much by memory and instinct as by anything they could actually see. These weren't dramatic rescues, the kind that make it into headlines. They were quiet, ordinary house calls made under extraordinary conditions by people who simply felt a responsibility to show up anyway. Many of their names were never recorded anywhere. Their stories exist today only in scattered family memories, passed down quietly across generations. It's worth pausing on that kind of quiet courage for a moment. The kind that doesn't ask to be remembered, doesn't ask for anything at all, and simply does what needs to be done. One careful step at a time. Let your own body feel cared for now, the way those patients must have felt. Hearing a familiar knock at the door in the middle of all that white. Howling silence. Chapter 53. Ice on the East River. Let your eyelids feel heavy again. Calm and slow and unhurried. One of the rarest and strangest sights of the entire storm was the East River itself, which froze over almost completely, something that happened so infrequently it startled even long-time residents of the city. For a short while, the river looked less like flowing water and more like an extension of the snow-covered streets around it. A handful of adventurous souls, tempted by the unusual sight, tried walking across the frozen surface on foot. It proved, in more than one case, to be a serious mistake. The ice was far less stable than it appeared, and shifting tides eventually broke it apart beneath some of those who had ventured out, leaving them stranded on drifting ice floes until help could reach them. It's a small, vivid detail that captures something true about the entire storm. How deceptive stillness can be. How something that looks solid, calm, and safe from a distance can turn out to be far more fragile and far more dangerous than it first appears. Let your own rest tonight be the safer, simpler kind. Solid, steady, and completely secure. Chapter 54. A season remembered differently. This part is slow and reflective. Let your thoughts drift gently along with it. In the years that followed, March itself took on a slightly different feeling for people who had lived through the storm. Where March had once meant the quiet, welcome approach of spring, it now carried, for many, a small undercurrent of caution, a reminder that the season's calendar and the sky's actual intentions don't always agree with one another. Some people, decades later, still found themselves glancing a little more carefully at the clouds each March, almost without meaning to. Not out of fear, Exactly. More out of a quiet, permanent respect for how quickly the ordinary can turn extraordinary, and how little warning the world sometimes gives before it does not. It's not a heavy thought to end on. If anything, it's a gentle one, a reminder to notice the ordinary moments a little more closely, a little more gratefully, simply because we now know how quickly they can change. Let yourself notice this ordinary, quiet moment now, too, safe, warm, and settled, exactly as it is. Chapter 55, the last quiet hour. We're very near the end now. Let your whole body feel soft and heavy and completely at rest. Imagine, one final time, the very last quiet hour of the storm, the wind almost entirely gone, the snow no longer falling, the sky beginning, ever so slightly, to lighten along the horizon. Somewhere, a single door creaks open for the first time in days. Somewhere else, a child presses their face against a window, watching, waiting for permission to finally go outside and see the strange, transformed world for themselves. There's a particular kind of peace that settles over a place right after something difficult has finally ended. Not celebration, exactly, not yet. Just relief, just stillness, just the simple, quiet realization that the hardest part is over and everything from here will slowly become easier. Let that same peace settle fully over you now, too. The hardest part of your own day already behind you. Nothing left ahead of you tonight but rest. Chapter 56, the postman's long route. Let your body sink even deeper now. Slow, heavy, and calm. Mail carriers in 1888 were expected, almost as a point of pride, to complete their routes no matter the weather. During the blizzard, many tried to honor that expectation anyway, setting out with their satchels into conditions that made even short distances feel impossibly long. Some turned back after only a block or two, forced by the wind and snow to admit defeat for the first time in their careers. Others pressed on much further than was wise, delivering what they could to the handful of houses they were able to reach before the storm finally overwhelmed even their determination. It's a small, easily forgotten detail of the story, but a telling one. So many of the people caught up in this event weren't looking for anything extraordinary. They were simply trying to do their ordinary jobs in a world that had, without warning, become entirely extraordinary around them. Let your own evening feel wonderfully ordinary by comparison. Nothing to deliver, nowhere to walk, nothing at all required of you except rest. Chapter 57, a warm room, shared by firelights. Low your breathing again, all the way down, in and out, gentle and unhurried. In countless homes during those long, snowbound evenings, families gathered close around whatever fire or stove they had, sharing the same small pool of warmth and light. Conversation slowed to match the mood of the storm outside, quieter, more thoughtful, less hurried than usual. Without much else to do, people found themselves truly listening to one another, perhaps more closely than they had in a very long time. Children, wrapped in blankets, listened wide-eyed to stories their parents and grandparents told about winters long past. Adults, for once, allowed themselves to simply sit, without the usual pull of errands or obligations waiting just outside the door. For a few days, entire households moved at exactly the same slow, quiet pace. There's a gentle lesson tucked into that image, if you'd like to carry it with you tonight. How a shared, quiet room, lit only by a small, warm flame, can feel like more than enough. Let your own space feel like that kind of room right now. Warm, calm, and complete. Chapter 58. The quiet return of ordinary days let your eyelids grow heavy again. There's almost nothing left now but rest. Weeks after the storm had fully passed, life along the coast slipped back into its familiar rhythms so completely that, for many people, the memory of those 4 extraordinary days began to feel almost unreal, like something that had happened to someone else, in some other, stranger version of their city. Markets reopened fully. Streetcars ran their routes without incident. Children returned to school. And for a while, the storm was simply the thing everyone talked about before moving on to whatever came next. And yet, underneath that quiet return to normal life, something had shifted permanently in how cities were built, in how neighbors thought of one another, in how people, forever after, glanced just a little more carefully at a gathering gray sky. Let your own thoughts settle into that same quiet, ordinary rhythm now. Nothing extraordinary required of you tonight. Nothing at all, except the simple, familiar comfort of drifting off to sleep. Chapter 59. One final, slow breath. This is truly the final chapter now. Let everything in you soften completely. Picture the whole story. One last time, from a great and gentle distance. A quiet coastline. A single unexpected storm. 4 difficult days. And then, slowly, surely, a long, peaceful return to calm. Streets reopened. Voices returned. Warmth came back, drop by drop, the way it always eventually does. There's nothing left to carry from this story now, except a simple, quiet feeling that even the largest, most overwhelming things eventually pass. That help arrives in small, quiet ways long before anything grand or dramatic does. And that rest, real, complete rest, is always waiting patiently on the other side of even the longest, hardest day. Take one final, slow breath in and let it out completely, gently, all the way. There's nothing left to do now but sleep. Chapter 60. The Bootmaker Shop. Let your body settle again. Warm and heavy. A few more quiet moments before we finally close this story. Along one snow-buried street, a small bootmaker shop stayed open through nearly the entire storm, its owner refusing to close even as drifts piled up against his own front window. He wasn't expecting customers. Hardly anyone could reach him in weather like that, but he kept his stove burning anyway. The door unlocked, a single lamp glowing softly in the window, not by the second day. A few travelers, caught outside and desperate for shelter, noticed that small light and made their way toward it. The bootmaker welcomed them in without hesitation, sharing what little food and warmth he had. None of them had ever met before that afternoon. By the time the storm finally passed, several had become lifelong friends, bound together by nothing more than one small, stubbornly lit lamp in a window. It's easy to imagine how many other small lamps and how many other windows quietly did the very same thing that week, all up and down the coast, inviting someone in from the cold, expecting nothing at all in return. Let your own space feel like that same small, warm room now, lit softly, safe, and welcoming, with nothing left to do but rest. Chapter 61. What the storm could not take, we're very close to the true end now. Let your whole body feel completely soft and warm, and still, for all that the storm buried, disrupted, and swept away streets, wires, ships, and so many ordinary plans. There were certain things it never managed to touch at all. It couldn't take away the quiet loyalty of a lighthouse keeper staying at his post. It couldn't take away a shared loaf of bread, or a shared fire, or a shared story told slowly by candlelight. It couldn't take away the simple, steady patience of people who kept believing, without any real proof, that morning would eventually come. Those things stayed exactly as they were, untouched all the way through the worst of it. And in many ways, they're the same quiet things carrying you gently toward rest tonight, more than 100 years later. A warm, safe space, a little patience, a quiet trust that morning will come, exactly the way it always has. Let all of that settle over you now, completely, one final time. Calm, warm, and safe, with nothing left ahead of you tonight but sleep. Good night. Chapter 62. A final walk through the archives. Let your body feel loose and heavy again. Just a little more of this quiet story left to drift through, long after everyone who lived through the storm had passed away themselves. Historians and librarians carefully preserved what remained of it. Old photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten letters tucked away in drawers for generations. Entire collections were built around those 4 days. Hundreds of fragile photographs showing familiar streets buried beyond recognition. Brittle pages describing a metropolis brought entirely to its knees. Looking through those old collections today feels a little like opening a very old, very careful letter from the past, a quiet message, patiently waiting more than a century to be read again. Every photograph, every clipping was placed there deliberately, by someone who understood that this story deserved to outlive the people who had actually lived it in its own quiet way. That's exactly what's happening right now, too. This same old story, carefully preserved for well over 100 years, finally reaching you tonight. In this soft and quiet moment before sleep, let your own thoughts feel that same gentle continuity now, connected, calmly, to everyone who has ever needed a quiet story to help them rest. Chapter 63. The Last Snowflake. This really is the final chapter now. Let your whole body soften completely, all the way down. Somewhere, on the 4th day, there was a single final snowflake, the very last one the storm ever produced, drifting down slowly, quietly, unnoticed by almost everyone, landing softly on a rooftop or a windowsill, or the frozen surface of a street that had already seen so much snow it hardly mattered anymore. No one recorded the exact moment it fell. No one could have known, at the time, that it was the last one. It simply arrived as quietly as the very first snowflake had. Days before, and then the storm, having said everything it needed to say, was simply finished. Let that same quiet, unremarkable ending settle over your own evening now, too. No need for anything dramatic. No need for a grand finish. Just a slow, soft, final moment of stillness. settling gently over you, the way that last small snowflakes settled gently over an old, tired, resilient city more than 100 years ago. Rest now. There's nothing left to hold on to except sleep. Chapter 64. A quiet word of thanks. Let your body feel completely at ease now. Just a few final, soft words before the story truly closes. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through, for letting it move slowly, for letting it wander gently through small, quiet details instead of rushing toward some big, dramatic ending. Stories like this one aren't really about the storm at all. Not fully. They're about the small human moments tucked inside something enormous. A shared loaf of bread, a lit lamp in a window, a lighthouse keeper who never once considered leaving his post. If any part of tonight's story helped you feel calmer, or helped your thoughts slow down even a little, that's really all it was ever meant to do. There's no test at the end of this. No details you need to remember. Just the simple, quiet feeling of having been carried gently for a little while toward rest. Wherever you are right now, let yourself feel safe and warm and completely unhurried. The storm, all these years later, is long over. The streets have long since reopened. And now, quietly, so can you. Let your own long day close gently. The same way that old story finally did. Sleep well. Chapter 65 somewhere. Still snowing gently, just a few more soft words. And then, truly, we're done. Imagine, one last time, a small window somewhere along that old coastline, long after the story we've told tonight has ended. Outside, snow is falling again, not the wild, howling snow of the great storm, just an ordinary, gentle snowfall, the kind that makes a quiet street look soft and new. Inside, someone is settled into a warm chair, listening to that same soft snowfall against the glass, feeling nothing but calm. No storm to fear, no wind to listen for, just quiet, unhurried snow, falling slowly, the way it always eventually does, long after every storm has passed. Let that be the very last image you carry with you tonight. A soft, gentle snowfall, a warm and quiet room, and nothing left to do anywhere at all, except rest. Good night, truly, and sleep well. Chapter 66, one last. Slow descent. Let your whole body sink now, heavier than before. This truly is the final stretch of the story. Imagine, gently, that you are slowly descending, not falling, just softly sinking, the way a single snowflake settles unhurried through still air, drifting slowly downward without ever needing to rush. Down and down, a little further with every breath you take. With each slow breath in, feel yourself settle a little deeper into wherever you're resting. With each slow breath out, feel any remaining tension drift quietly away. The way melted snow eventually finds its way, without effort, back to the sea. There is nothing left to think about now. No storm, no city, no story left to follow. Just this slow, gentle sinking, down and down, softer and heavier with every breath, until there's nothing left at all except calm, quiet, restful sleep. Let it come now, gently, in its own time, exactly the way morning always does. A slow ending. Let your body feel heavy now. Let your breathing settle into something slow and even and easy. Somewhere, far away and long ago, the snow finally melted. The streets reappeared. Life, in its familiar rhythm, returned to New York, to Boston, to all the small towns along that coastline. Children who had once used towering snowdrifts as makeshift mountains grew up and told their own children about it. Years later, in quiet rooms very much like the one you might be resting in right now, the storm passed, as every storm does. And what it left behind wasn't just snowmelt and cleared streets. It left behind quieter cities that had learned gently how to be a little more careful with each other. And it left behind stories passed down softly from one generation to the next, the way this one has just been passed on to you. You don't need to remember any of it right. Now, just let your eyes stay closed. Let your breathing stay slow, and let the rest of the night carry you quietly, the way it's carried so many people before you. Good night.